All right, so you want to level up your knowledge, right? Like really understand something deeply, but without feeling totally overwhelmed by information.
Yeah, who doesn't?
I know. And that's exactly what we're doing today. Think of this as a deep dive, a shortcut through this hefty text on research methodology by C.R. Kothari.
Hmm. That sounds familiar.
We're pulling out the most important bits, the insights that really matter, and we're going to break them down in a way that hopefully makes them stick.
It's about getting to the core of how research is done scientifically in a way that anyone can grasp.
And honestly, this stuff is surprisingly relevant to so many things. It's not just for academics, you know?
Right, right.
Whether you're trying to figure out why a competitor's product is suddenly selling like crazy, or you're trying to make sense of a dense report in a field you're new to.
Or maybe you're just curious about how the world works, like how do we really know things?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right in. What is research methodology in plain English?
Well, in the simplest terms, it's like the science of how research is done.
Oh, okay.
It's about understanding the steps a researcher takes and, more importantly, the logic behind those steps.
So it's more than just the methods or the techniques.
Right. It's the bigger picture.
Okay.
It's about understanding why you choose a specific method, what those methods can actually tell you about the problem, and how to make sure you're getting reliable and meaningful findings.
So it's kind of like having a roadmap, a strategy for getting to the truth.
Exactly. It's like you wouldn't just start building a house without a blueprint,
Right,
right?
yeah, that would be chaotic.
An architect thinks carefully about the materials, the design, the structure, everything before they even break ground. Research methodology is kind of like that blueprint for scientific investigation.
So you're saying it's about being intentional and systematic in your approach.
Absolutely. You need to know which tools to use, when to use them, and how to interpret what they tell you.
Got it. So you keep mentioning the word scientific, which makes sense, I guess.
Right. And this is where the scientific method comes in. Research methodology is deeply rooted in this idea of systematically pursuing truth, using logic and observation.
Oh, okay.
Like, there's this great quote by Carl Pearson: "The unity of all sciences consists alone in its methods, not in its material."
That's a good one.
It basically means that what truly unites all scientific disciplines is their shared commitment to this systematic way of understanding the world.
So logic and systematic thinking are key. What's the very first step in this whole research process?
Well, the first thing you need to do is figure out what you're actually trying to find out, right?
Yeah, that seems pretty basic.
It's called formulating the research problem.
Okay, so it's about getting specific about what you want to investigate.
Exactly. It's like, imagine you have a telescope and you're looking at the night sky.
I like this analogy.
At first, everything is kind of blurry.
Right.
But then you adjust the focus, and suddenly, one particular star becomes crystal clear. Formulating the research problem is that focusing process.
Oh, I see. You go from a vague idea to a sharp, well-defined question.
Exactly. And Kothari talks about two main types of research problems. One type is about understanding states of nature.
States of nature, what does that mean?
It's about describing how things are. Like, what's the current rate of deforestation in the Amazon? Or what percentage of people believe in climate change?
Oh, okay, so it's about describing things as they exist.
Right. The other type of research problem is about relationships between variables.
Relationships, like how things are connected.
Exactly. It's about exploring how different factors influence each other. Like, does exposure to violent video games increase aggression in children? Or does regular exercise reduce the risk of heart disease?
Ah, so cause and effect type of questions.
Yeah, or even just correlations. It's about understanding how things are related to each other.
Okay, so you start with a broad interest and then narrow it down into a specific testable question. How do you actually go about doing that?
Well, one of the best things you can do is just talk to people. Talk to colleagues, experts in the field, anyone who might have some insights into the area you're interested in.
So brainstorming and gathering information.
Yeah. And if you're in an academic setting, you definitely want to talk to a professor or a mentor who can guide you.
Makes sense.
And in a business or government context, the research problem often comes from within the organization itself. So talking to stakeholders and understanding the context of the problem is really important.
It's about getting a clear understanding of the issue before you even start planning the research, right?
Absolutely. It's about making sure your research question is relevant, feasible, and actually answerable.
Okay, so we've got our research question. What comes next?
Well, now you need to think about what kind of research is going to help you answer that question.
Oh, okay, so there are different types of research.
Yes, and one fundamental distinction is between applied research and fundamental research.
Applied versus fundamental, what's the difference?
Applied research is all about solving specific, practical problems.
So it's research with a very clear, immediate goal.
Exactly. It's often called action research because it's focused on taking action to address a problem.
Like what kind of problems?
It could be anything, really. Like a company might do market research to figure out why a new product isn't selling well.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Or a government agency might conduct an evaluation study to see if a new social program is actually effective.
Ah, I see. So it's very focused on practical applications.
Right. Fundamental research, on the other hand, is more about expanding our general knowledge and understanding of the world.
So it's less about solving a specific problem and more about just learning for the sake of learning.
Exactly. It's driven by curiosity and the desire to understand fundamental principles. It's sometimes called basic or pure research.
Like what kind of research would that be?
It could be things like research into laws of physics, the origins of the universe, or the workings of the human brain.
Ah, so big picture questions about how things work.
Right. And while it might not have immediate practical applications, fundamental research can often lead to unexpected breakthroughs down the line.
So it's like laying the groundwork for future discoveries.
Exactly. It's about pushing the boundaries of our knowledge.
Okay, so we've got our research question. We know what type of research we're doing. What's the next step in the planning process?
Now it's time to create a research design.
Research design, what's that?
It's basically the overall plan for your study. It's the roadmap that outlines how you're going to collect and analyze your data to answer your research question.
So it's like the blueprint for your research project.
Exactly. And there are a lot of factors that influence how you design a study.
Like what?
Well, first of all, you have to consider how you're going to collect your data. Are you going to use surveys, interviews, experiments, observations? What's the best way to get the information you need?
Ah, yeah, the methods you'll use.
Right. And then you have to think about your own skills and resources as a researcher. What are you good at? What kind of budget and time frame do you have?
So practical limitations.
Exactly. And of course, the nature of your research question itself will also influence your design.
How so?
Well, if you're doing exploratory research where you're just starting to explore a new area, you'll need a more flexible design that allows you to be open to new discoveries.
So more freedom to adjust as you go.
Right. But if you're doing descriptive research, where you're trying to paint a detailed picture of a situation, you'll need a more structured design that emphasizes accuracy and minimizing bias.
Okay, so different goals require different approaches.
Exactly. And if you're testing a hypothesis where you're trying to establish a cause and effect relationship, you'll need a design that allows you to control for other factors that might influence your results.
So experiments would come in there.
Exactly. And often, a single research project will involve elements of all these different types of designs.
Okay, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. The best research design is the one that's tailored to your specific research question and the resources you have available.
Now, the text talks about experimental designs, and it brings up Professor R.A. Fisher in agricultural research. That seems like an unusual connection.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
A lot of the foundational principles of modern experimental design came from agricultural research.
Really? Like how?
Well, Professor Fisher, he was working at this agricultural research station in England called Rothamsted,
Okay.
and he was trying to figure out the best way to design experiments to test the effectiveness of different fertilizers and farming techniques.
So it was all about optimizing crop yields.
Yeah, and he realized that by dividing fields into smaller plots and randomly assigning different treatments to those plots, he could control for variations in soil and other factors.
Ah, so it was about making the comparisons more accurate.
Exactly. And it's funny, we still use a lot of those terms from agriculture in experimental design today, like treatment and yield.
So those terms have a longer history than I realized.
Right. But the basic principles are still the same. Controlling for extraneous variables, randomly assigning treatments, and replicating your experiments to get reliable results.
What are some examples of these experimental designs?
Well, one simple design is the before and after without control design.
Okay.
So you measure something in a group, then you introduce a treatment, and then you measure it again.
So you're looking for a change after the treatment is applied.
Right. But the problem is that other things could have happened during that time besides the treatment that might have caused the change.
So it's hard to say for sure if the treatment was the cause.
Exactly. So a better design is the before and after with control design.
Okay. How does that one work?
You have two groups. One group gets the treatment and the other group doesn't. And you measure both groups before and after the treatment.
So you're comparing the changes in both groups.
Right. And if the group that got the treatment shows a bigger change than the control group, you can be more confident that the treatment was the cause.
Ah, that makes sense. So the control group helps you isolate the effect of the treatment.
Exactly. Now, another design is the after only with control design.
Okay, what's different about this one?
In this design, you only measure the two groups after the treatment has been applied.
So no before measurements.
Right. And this can be helpful in situations where the act of measuring something before the treatment might actually influence the results.
Oh, I see.
But this design really depends on the assumption that the two groups were comparable to begin with.
So random assignment is crucial here.
Absolutely. You want to make sure that any differences you see after the treatment are actually due to the treatment and not some pre-existing difference between the groups.
Okay, so those are some basic experimental designs. The text also talks about completely randomized design and factorial designs, which sound a lot more complex.
Well, they are a bit more sophisticated, but the basic principles are still the same. Completely randomized design, or CR design, focuses on randomly assigning subjects to different treatment groups.
So it's all about making sure the groups are as similar as possible before the treatment.
Exactly. And then factorial designs, those are used when you want to look at the effects of multiple factors at the same time.
Oh, okay.
Like imagine you're testing the effectiveness of a new drug.
Okay.
You might want to see if the drug works differently for men and women, and you might also want to see if it works differently for people of different ages.
So you'd have multiple factors, gender and age.
Exactly. And a factorial design would allow you to look at the effects of both factors individually and in combination.
Ah, I see. So you can get a more nuanced understanding of how different factors interact.
Exactly. And that could be really important for understanding complex phenomena.
Okay, we've got our research problem, we've chosen our type of research, we've designed our study. Now, often you can't study every single person or thing you're interested in.
Right. That's where sampling comes in.
Sampling, like choosing a smaller group to represent the whole.
Exactly. It's usually not practical or even possible to study an entire population, especially if it's large and diverse.
So you select a smaller group, a sample, that is representative of the population you're interested in.
Right. And if you do it carefully, the results you get from your sample can be generalized to the larger population.
Okay, so good sampling is crucial for making valid inferences. What are some of the key considerations in sampling?
Well, one important concept is sampling error.
Sampling error. What's that?
It's the natural variation you get when you study a sample instead of the entire population.
So there's always going to be some difference between the sample and the population just by chance.
Right. And we can estimate how much sampling error there is, but we can never completely eliminate it.
So it's about minimizing that error as much as possible.
Right. And one way to do that is to increase your sample size.
So the bigger the sample, the less sampling error.
Generally, yes. But there's a trade-off because larger samples can be more expensive and time-consuming to collect.
Ah, so it's about finding the right balance.
Exactly. And sometimes, simply increasing the sample size isn't the most effective way to reduce sampling error.
Really? What else can you do?
Well, using a more efficient sampling technique can often be more effective than just increasing the size of your sample.
Oh, okay, so there are different ways to select a sample.
Yes, and one of the most basic methods is simple random sampling.
Simple random sampling.
This is where every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected for the sample.
So it's like drawing names out of a hat.
Exactly. But in practice, researchers often use more complex sampling techniques, sometimes combining different methods to get the most representative sample possible.
Okay, so there's more to it than just random selection.
Right. And some other common techniques include systematic sampling and stratified sampling.
How do those work?
Well, systematic sampling involves selecting every nth item from a list.
So you might choose every 10th person on a list of customers.
Exactly. And it's not strictly random, but it can be a good approximation if the list is randomized to begin with.
Okay. And what about stratified sampling?
Stratified sampling is used when your population has distinct subgroups, or strata.
Like different age groups or income levels.
Right. And you divide the population into these strata, and then draw a random sample from each stratum.
So you're making sure you have representation from each subgroup.
Exactly. And this can give you a more accurate picture of the overall population, especially if the subgroups are very different from each other.
So the choice of sampling technique really depends on the characteristics of the population you're studying.
Exactly. And it's an important decision that can significantly affect the validity of your research findings.
Okay, we've got our sample selected. Now we need to actually collect the data. And that brings us to measurement and scaling techniques, right? Why is it so important to think carefully about how we measure things in research?
Well, measurement is at the heart of research, really. It's how we turn abstract concepts into concrete data that we can analyze.
So it's about quantifying things, making them measurable.
Exactly. But the thing is, measurement is never perfect.
Oh, right. There's always some degree of error.
Exactly. And being aware of the potential sources of error is crucial for ensuring the quality of your data.
So where do these errors typically come from?
Well, some errors come from the respondents themselves. People might not always be honest in their answers, they might not fully understand the questions, or they might just be tired or distracted.
So human factors can introduce bias.
Right. And the situation in which you're collecting data can also influence the results. If people feel pressured or uncomfortable, they might not give accurate responses.
That makes sense.
And then, of course, the researcher themselves can also introduce errors.
Really? How so?
Well, the way you phrase your questions can influence how people respond.
Yeah, leading questions can be a problem.
Exactly. And researchers can also have unconscious biases that can affect how they interpret the data.
So it's important to be aware of your own biases.
Absolutely. And there are techniques for minimizing these errors, like carefully designing your questionnaires, training your interviewers, and using standardized procedures.
So it's about being as rigorous and objective as possible.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to actually measuring things, there are different types of scales you can use.
Scales, like rating scales.
Yes, rating scales are one type, but there are also ranking scales, where you ask people to compare different items.
Okay, so rating versus ranking.
Right. And then there are different levels of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio.
Oh, okay, break those down for me.
Nominal scales are just categories, like male or female, or different types of cars.
Oh, okay, so just labels.
Right. Ordinal scales put things in order, but they don't tell you the distance between the points, like ranking your preferences for different brands of coffee.
So you know the order, but not the magnitude of the difference.
Exactly. Interval scales have equal intervals between the points, but there's no true 0 point, like temperature in Fahrenheit or Celsius.
Okay, so you can say that 20 degrees is 10 degrees warmer than 10 degrees, but you can't say that 20 degrees is twice as warm as 10 degrees.
Right, because there's no absolute 0 point. And then ratio scales have both equal intervals and a true 0 point, like height, weight, or income.
Ah, so with ratio scales, you can make meaningful ratios, like someone who earns $100,000 earns twice as much as someone who earns $50,000.
Exactly. And understanding these different levels of measurement is important because it determines what kinds of statistical analyses you can do with your data.
Okay, so the type of scale you use depends on what you're trying to measure and how you want to analyze the data.
Right. Now, there are also specific techniques for measuring attitudes, which can be a bit trickier to measure than things like height or weight.
Right, attitudes are more subjective.
Exactly. And some common techniques for measuring attitudes include Likert scales, semantic differential scales, and Gutman scales.
Okay, let's unpack those one by one. What's a Likert scale?
A Likert scale presents a series of statements, and you ask people to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement with each statement.
Oh yeah, I've seen those in surveys, like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree.
Exactly. And each response option is assigned a numerical value. So you can calculate a total score that represents the person's attitude.
Okay, so it's a way to quantify an attitude based on agreement with different statements.
Right. And a key part of creating a good Likert scale is choosing statements that effectively discriminate between people with different attitudes.
So the statements need to be well crafted.
Exactly. Now, the semantic differential scale, that one uses pairs of opposite adjectives,
Oh,
like good, bad, strong, weak, active, passive. And people rate the object or concept they're evaluating on each of these scales.
so they choose a point along a continuum between the two adjectives.
Right. And this can be a very efficient way to capture the nuances of people's attitudes because you're getting both the direction and the intensity of their feelings.
That makes sense. And what about the Gutman scale?
The Gutman scale is a bit more complex. It aims to create a scale where if someone agrees with a statement, They'll also agree with all less extreme statements related to the same attitude.
So it's kind of a hierarchical scale.
Exactly. And if you can create a good Gubman scale, it can be very precise in measuring a single dimension of an attitude.
Okay. But it sounds like it might be difficult to develop a good Gutman scale.
Yeah, it can be challenging, especially for complex attitudes. And there's also multidimensional scaling, or MDS, which is used to visually map how people perceive the similarities and differences between different objects or concepts.
MDS? That sounds pretty advanced.
It is a more advanced technique, but basically it takes data about how similar or different things are perceived to be and creates a map where things that are seen as similar are closer together and things that are seen as different are farther apart.
So it's a way to visualize complex relationships.
Exactly. And it can be really helpful for understanding how people make sense of the world around them.
Okay, so we figured out how to measure what we want to measure. Now we need to actually collect the information. What are some of the main methods for gathering primary data in research?
There are a lot of different methods, but some of the most common ones include observation, interviews, and questionnaires.
Okay, let's talk about each of those. Observation, that seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it can be as simple as just watching people's behavior in a natural setting.
Like observing shoppers in a grocery store.
Exactly. But observation can also be more structured, where you have a specific checklist of behaviors you're looking for.
So it can be both qualitative and quantitative.
Right. Now, interviews, those allow you to get more in-depth information from people.
Because you can ask follow-up questions and really probe their thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. And interviews can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured.
What's the difference?
Structured interviews have a set list of questions that you ask everyone in the same order.
So it's very standardized.
Right. Semi-structured interviews have a list of topics you want to cover, but you have more flexibility to ask follow-up questions and let the conversation flow more naturally.
Okay, so there's a bit more room for exploration.
Right. And then unstructured interviews are the most open-ended. You might just have a general topic in mind, and you let the interviewee lead the conversation.
So it's more like a conversation than an interrogation.
Exactly. And each type of interview has its own strengths and weaknesses, depending on your research question and the kind of information you're trying to get.
Okay, and what about questionnaires? Those are very common in research.
Yes, questionnaires are a really efficient way to collect data from a lot of people.
Because they're self-administered, so you don't need to be there in person.
Exactly. You can mail them out, distribute them online, or even just hand them out in person.
And they can be used to measure a wide range of things.
Right, from demographics to attitudes to behaviors.
The text also talks about schedules. What are those?
Schedules are basically questionnaires that are administered by an interviewer.
So instead of filling it out themselves, the respondent answers the questions verbally, and the interviewer records their responses.
Exactly. And this can be helpful in situations where people might have difficulty reading or writing.
Ah, I see. So it makes the data collection more accessible.
Right. And the interviewer can also clarify any questions or confusion the respondent might have.
So you get higher quality data that way.
Potentially, yes. But schedules are also more expensive and time-consuming to administer than questionnaires.
Okay, so there are trade-offs to consider with each method.
Right. The choice of data collection method really depends on the nature of your research question, your target population, and your available resources.
Okay, we've collected our data. Now what?
Now it's time to process and analyze the data.
So we're talking about turning that raw data into something meaningful.
Exactly. The first step is processing the data, which involves cleaning it up, organizing it, and preparing it for analysis.
Okay, what does that actually involve?
Well, it typically involves editing the data to check for errors and inconsistencies.
Like making sure all the responses are complete and legible.
Right. And then coding the data, which means assigning numerical or categorical codes to the responses.
So you're turning words into numbers or categories that you can analyze statistically.
Exactly. And then classifying the data, which means grouping similar responses together.
So creating categories or groups based on shared characteristics.
Right. And finally, tabulating the data, which means organizing it into tables or charts.
Okay, so you're creating a visual representation of the data that makes it easier to understand.
Exactly. And these processing steps are really important for ensuring the accuracy and reliability of your analysis.
Once the data is processed, then comes the actual analysis.
Right. And the type of analysis you do will depend on your research question and the type of data you have.
Okay, so different questions require different analytical techniques.
Exactly. You might calculate simple descriptive statistics, like means and standard deviations, to summarize your data.
Okay, so those give you a general overview of the data.
Right. Or you might use more complex statistical tests to see if there are significant relationships between variables.
So you're looking for patterns and connections in the data.
Exactly. And the choice of statistical techniques will depend on the level of measurement of your variables and the specific hypotheses you're testing.
The text talks about handling don't know responses and using percentages. Those are practical considerations, right?
They are, don't know, responses can be tricky because they don't give you a clear answer.
Uh,
Sometimes you can just exclude them from the analysis, but sometimes they might be meaningful in themselves.
oh, I see.
And percentages are often used to present data in a more understandable way.
Yeah, they make it easier to compare different groups.
Right. But it's important to be careful when using percentages
Yeah.
because they can be misleading if you don't have a large enough sample size.
Okay, so you have to be mindful of how you present the data.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's multivariate analysis, which is used when you're looking at the relationships among multiple variables at the same time.
Multivariate analysis, that sounds complicated.
It can be, but it's a very powerful set of techniques.
Like what?
Well, there's multiple regression, which allows you to predict one variable based on multiple other variables.
So it's about understanding how different factors contribute to an outcome.
Right. And there's factor analysis, which can be used to identify underlying patterns or dimensions in your data.
So it's about simplifying complex data.
Exactly. And there are a lot of other multivariate techniques, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so analyzing data can range from simple calculations to very sophisticated statistical modeling.
Right. The key is to choose the right tools for the job based on your research question and the characteristics of your data.
Now, once you've analyzed the data, you need to think about what your findings actually mean.
Right. That's where interpretation comes in.
So it's about going beyond the numbers and explaining the significance of your results.
Exactly. Interpretation is where you connect your findings back to your research question and to the existing body of knowledge in your field.
So it's about placing your findings in context.
Right. And it's also about acknowledging any limitations of your study and suggesting directions for future research.
Okay, and all of this culminates in the research report.
Yes, the research report is the formal document where you present your entire study, from your initial question to your final conclusions.
So it's the culmination of all your hard work.
Exactly. And it's important to present your research in a clear, concise, and organized way.
What are the essential elements of a research report?
Well, it typically starts with an introduction, where you state your research problem, your objectives, and the scope of your study.
So you set the stage for the reader.
Right. Then you have a literature review, where you summarize the existing research on your topic.
Okay, so you show how your research fits into the broader field.
Exactly. Then you have a methodology section, where you describe in detail how you conducted your research.
So you're being transparent about your methods and procedures.
Right. This is really important for allowing others to evaluate the quality of your research.
Okay, and then comes the results section, right?
Yes. The results section is where you present your findings, often using tables and figures to illustrate your data.
So you're showing what you discovered.
Right. And then you have a discussion section where you interpret your results, discuss their implications, and connect them back to your research question and the existing literature.
So you're explaining the meaning and significance of your findings.
Exactly. And finally, you have a conclusion section where you summarize your main findings and offer recommendations for future research or action.
Okay, so it's a comprehensive and structured presentation of your entire research project.
Right. And there are specific guidelines for writing each section of the report. But the most important thing is to be clear, concise, and accurate.
So good writing is just as important as good research.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll mention is the role of computers in research, which is huge these days.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine doing research without computers now.
Right. Computers have revolutionized the way we collect, process, analyze, and present data.
They've made everything faster, more efficient, and more powerful.
Exactly. And there are so many software programs and tools available now that make research much easier and more sophisticated.
So from formulating your research question to writing your final report, computers play a vital role in every stage of the research process.
Absolutely. And understanding how to use these tools effectively is an essential skill for any researcher today.
So that was our deep dive into research methodology. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basic principles of scientific inquiry to the practicalities of designing, conducting, and reporting research.
It's a fascinating field that really gets to the heart of how we know what we know.
And while we've just scratched the surface today, hopefully,